Verse 5, now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. Once again, the author keeps telling us they've got a lot of stuff. They're loaded to the brim, right? In fact, they're full of wealth is actually the reason why they're arguing, right? And not just them arguing, Abram and Lot, but even their managers, their herders, right? Those under them, they're arguing, fighting over each other because there's not enough land, not enough space to fit all their stuff, right? So for them, with all these flocks, maybe it's fields for all their herds and animals to graze on, water sources to drink from. And what's more, we're told the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. So I think what's happening here is that the Canaanites and the Perizzites, they've settled there already. They've built their towns and cities in the best spots. While Abram and Lot, they have to sort of move around from place to place to sustain their flocks, which would be quite a challenge when they both had so much stuff. And so what does Abram do, right? Think about it. If you're in Abram's situation, what would you do? Let's duke it out, right? Let's pit our servants against each other. Let's see who wins. Or, look, mate, I'm your uncle. You should respect the elder. Or, look, punk, God gave me the promises, not you. Stop arguing with my herders, right? Abram would be completely reasonable to do something like this. But what does Abram actually say to Lot? Verse 8. Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. There, relatives here in the ESV, it says kinsmen, but there's a footnote that says, or literally, brothers. Okay. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So basically what Abram is saying is, look, turn your head 360 degrees. Look all around you. You take first dibs, okay? Wherever you want to go, I won't compete with you. In fact, I'll go in the opposite direction. Last time we saw that Abram was radical in his faith in God, right? Radical in not trying to make his own name great, unlike the rest of the world, the tower builders, making their name great. In particular, he cares only for the names of others. For God in particular, but in a life group that I had in my church, we also looked at some Jewish tradition, which brings us to chapter 11 and shows that actually Abram actually cares about the name of his dead brother Nahor as well. And so even though last week Abram failed miserably in Egypt, today once again we see the side of Abram that makes him so special. Right? Lot, my young nephew, you take the honor of choosing where you'll go. I'll play second fiddle. I won't get in your way. That's just radical kindness, isn't it? And how does Lot respond? Lot looked around, lifted his eyes, literally. And note the redundancy here. He lifted his eyes and he saw. There's sort of like an emphasizing here of his physical senses. It's like he's using his bodily senses to survey the land, and he sees something that he likes. The whole plain of the Jordan. What does it look like? It's well watered, like the garden of the Lord, right? Like the Garden of Eden. And it's also like the land of Egypt. Remember, last time we saw Egypt was known for its fertility because of the floodplains. Oh, rich, beautiful, productive land. And Lot says, I see that, and I'm going to pick that for myself, right? Now, there are some ominous signs here. I don't know if you picked it up in these verses that aren't quite right here. Can anyone spot any clues as to why something might be amiss here? Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeah, so we, even with our knowledge of what happens next, we see this, oh, that's not great. What else? Which direction is Sodom and Gomorrah in? East. Okay, so he goes east as well. And then in a later verse, it's like he goes to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in the east. So can you see everything lining up now? All the Genesis 3 beats are lining up, right? The chosen one does something, and the unchosen one heads east, away from God, towards the cities, right? And so maybe it's just representing him moving away from God, but maybe it's also spiritually himself, like distancing himself away, walking from God's way. And the selfishness of Lot is hinted at here. The emphasis of looking around, seeing guided by his human senses, and the fact that he chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, right? Very earthly, very selfish picture. But Abram, on the other hand, does what he says he would do. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities, there it is, cities of the plain, and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So even now we know that Sodom and Gomorrah is not good. And so while Lot goes east, Abram remains on the west side of Jordan, in the land of Canaan. But that's not the end of the story here. Because as we've seen before in the calling of Abram, God responds in kind to Abram's actions. This is the part where my Bible study, we looked at Genesis 12 comes after Genesis 11, so there's a little Jewish tradition going on. But the tradition is that God actually responds to Abram because of how he took up Nahor's daughter to be his wife. Yeah, it's a long story. Okay, but anyway, it looks like God is again responding to Abram here now. So let's see how God responds. Verse 14. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "You look around, all around you, where you are, to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could also be counted. Go, walk the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." Right? There's another promise here, same as in chapter 12, but what's different? It's expanded, right? This time it's more descriptive, right? The north, the south, the east, and the west. You look with your own, just as Lot did, right? Now God is saying, you look with your own eyes, see 360 degrees all around you. This will all be yours and your children's, right? And once again, God promises offspring, descendants for Abram. But then even this promise is expanded, right? So many, that'll be as many as the dust on the earth. In other words, uncountable. No one's going to try and count the dust of the earth, right? Not just the preservation of his own name, not just a small family that would last through the generations, but it would explode, right? Multiply beyond his wildest imagination. And then we read these familiar words again, verse 18. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, where he built an altar to the Lord. Again, another set of great trees, right? He pitches his tent, not build a city, and he builds another altar to the Lord, honoring the memory of Yahweh's name. Okay, so we looked at the passage again. Let's do what we've done before to stop and consider, well, let's see what repeated words there are to see if the author might be trying to tell us something important. And this time, I want us to look at verses 10 to 8. Don't worry if you can't see this, by the way. But even as you read the Bibles in front of you, what might be some repeated words that you see over and over in this passage? Any takers? Right. If, was it? The east? Okay, yep, so east. So there's north, south, east, west, and then he goes east as well. Lot goes east. Yep, nice. Anyone else? Look. That's a huge one. Yep, look. Oh, wow, that's not right. Oh, well, there you go. I've got all the answers for you. Yeah, looked around. Awesome. So there's look and see, lifted your eyes. That happens a lot here, right? See all the plains. There's a repetition of what Lot does and what God tells Abram to do, right? And so what does, you've seen it already, what does this repetition tell us? When we see these two panels side by side, we're actually seeing that it's a repetition, right? What happens to Abram happens with Lot. There's like two panels, Exhibit A, Exhibit B. And when we have two panels side by side, what do you reckon we're supposed to do with that? Anyone? Contrast and compare? Yeah, I think I heard someone say contrast and compare. Exactly right. It's like spot the difference. And what are we supposed to spot, right? First, let's consider how God is responding to Abram. What does this repetition tell us about God's response to Abram? God is repaying Abram's kindness that he showed Lot. Have you noticed? Just what Lot does, God now tells Abram to do. Look around, all around you, just as God chose, right? It's not just some random blessing God is giving to him, but God is reflecting the same kindness that Abram showed to Lot back on to Abram. But is there any difference between the two? But, right? There's also an intensification. It's not just like, okay, what you did to Lot, I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. But it's like he multiplies it. He intensifies it. God will give all of the land, not just to the east, right? North, south, east, and west, not just in one direction. And finally, God tells Abram not just to look with his eyes, but to physically walk the breadth of the land, right? Physically go to the boundaries. I want you to go and experience the land for yourself, right? As your feet, your sandals crunch through the rocks, as you dip your toes in the cool waters of the Jordan River. Maybe pick a few grains of wheat and snack on while you're doing that, right? I want you to know, not just in your head, what I am promising. I want you to experience, to feel that with all your senses, the land that I am giving to your offspring one day. What Lot did? Now God tells him, you experience fully the land that I am going to give you and to your offspring. And what else is different? Well, first we see Lot chooses for himself, and that is God twice telling Abe, contrasted with God telling, I will give, right? Instead of choosing for yourself, God gives, right? Human seizing on the one side, grasping, just like what Abram did last time, right? Versus the free gift of what God is doing on the other side. And finally, as we've already seen, as Lot moves east, as he lives amongst the cities of the plain, Abram lives near the great trees. That's significant, isn't it? City versus trees. Human security, human ideas of greatness, human security versus walking with God in the garden. And so let's think about what the key takeaway here is. Maybe something like this. God repays Abram's kindness with even more kindness. Okay? Or maybe, to generalize it more, and this is where we're going to get a bit uncomfortable, when we are kind, God repays us with even greater kindness. Now, let's see, who is a bit uncomfortable with what's up on the screen? If I say this is the big idea, yeah, Brian is, anyone else? Yeah, a few, right? Why is it uncomfortable? Because it sounds like a prosperity gospel. It sounds like Abram is meriting, right, his reward from God. Our theology leans us towards that everything that we get, it's undeserved, right? It's pure grace. It's not earned, right? But let's think back. When did God actually give these promises to Abram? Right? It was way back in chapter 12, right? Before Abram let Lot choose the land before him. Before Egypt even. Okay, so it's not exactly that Abram earned the land by being generous, right? He's being repaid by kindness, like as a land. But we can't escape the fact that for whatever reason, the author is trying to make this link that God is treating Abram with the same kindness that Abram treated Lot. And so what can we say about this? How can we just put all this together without being a heretic? Well, let's see. I think this is the best I can come up with. Maybe you can come up with something better. But our kindness and generosity to others goes hand in hand with God's incredible kindness and generosity to us. Right? Our kindness and generosity to others goes hand in hand with God's incredible kindness and generosity to us. That is, even when it is God who is the one who initiates, God is the one who calls Abram, even when Abram fails as badly as we've seen last week, Abram's by no means perfect, but the right response to God's blessings, God's kindness and God's grace is to work out that faith, trusting God, trusting God's provision, which means if you trust God, you are free to be generous, to be kind to others. And as a result of that, that spirals back in, right? As Abram lives out his faith in generosity, God sees that radical kindness and intensifies the promise that he was already given. Does that sort of make sense? Right? The promise hasn't changed. He was going to inherit. He was going to have children. But God gives us this vivid picture. He intensifies his promise after Abram acts in faith to that promise. It's a cycle that keeps feeding back on itself. In fact, remember how the two mirror images, the two panels ends, right? Abram leans closer into God, pitching his tent among the trees, building another altar to the Lord, right? It's like that spiral, it's starting again, right? Isn't that just a great image of what being with God, in relationship with God is like? And so the call for us today is the same, okay? Let us ask us today, how can we live out our radical kindness and generosity as the response of the kindness that God has shown us already? Right? What are the ways that we can demonstrate our trust in God's promises? That our future is totally secure. Not just like, there's a hope out there, right? I think I'll get to heaven. But we know we are going to heaven because Jesus paid the price. How does that affect how we treat others, how we treat our possessions, right? Knowing that security, how can we say to others, you know what, you take first dibs, right? Even when we have the right to call shotgun, to let go of our rights, to reflect a little bit of that kindness that God has amazingly shown us in Jesus. Let's have a think about that, right? Maybe you have a friend or a colleague, maybe even a brother or sister in Christ, share something this week and you thought, you know, I think I can inject some kindness into their lives, right? They need a bit of kindness right now. Maybe you see someone who really wants a promotion coming up at work and you're like, maybe radical kindness looks like, you know what? I know my colleague really wants that promotion. Maybe I'll let them go for it first before I apply, right? Might sound completely ludicrous to you, but that's radical kindness, isn't it? Or maybe it's some financial help sometimes. Maybe it's just letting someone know that you're praying for them. Ask me how they're going when you've noticed that something's not right, right? Maybe you've noticed that your neighbor's lawn hasn't been mown for a while and it's growing out of control, and maybe radical kindness might just be to go over and offer to mow the lawn for them, right? It can be big, it can be small. What comes to your mind right now that you think, you know what? I can radically bless someone in my life this week if I do this. Because I want us to know that when we do that, when we sacrificially show kindness to others, then God will intensify his kindness and generosity to us. Now, I have to be careful here, just as Wes said, we're not preaching some kind of prosperity gospel. I'm not saying you give X amount to church and God will multiply it back into your bank accounts, right? I'm not saying that at all, right? I'm not promising even that if you are kind to others, then you're going to have a carefree life if you do that, right? But if we have understood the gospel correctly, then any sacrifice we make now of kindness, of generosity, we know that will be infinitely outweighed by that joy, the peace, the blessing that we would enjoy forever. We know that, right? That's not news to any of us. When asked, we can recite how nothing of this life can compare to the blessing in the age to come. But I want us to feel that truth, not just in our heads, right? We know that so much. We've been taught through that since Sunday school. But I want you to feel that in your hearts right now. Maybe God's response to Abram can help us out here. In particular, let's consider how God tells Abram to use his senses to experience the promises made to him, right? To realize God's blessing is not just some abstract hope in the future, but to get a foretaste, really whet your appetite in a manner of speaking, to step into it, even if it's not in its fullness. I don't know. How does that help? We can't walk the boundaries of the promised land. What are you talking about, Felix? Well, I think one thing we can do is to tangibly remind us of the promises to come. Because I bet all of us here have experienced kindness from those around us in some way, right? Particularly when it comes to the brothers and sisters around us, right? My guess is that You can think of some tangible thing yourself when you have become the recipient of amazing generosity. I can think of many myself. In my own church, a bunch of guys just came to move furniture for us when we were moving houses, letting our family stay at their place rent-free when we needed a place to stay, when we were selling our house, right? Kind words of encouragement when they could see that I was feeling a bit discouraged. Showing hospitality, inviting my family over for a meal, right? What are the tangible acts of kindness that you have experienced yourself from your fellow brothers and sisters? And may I suggest, this is but only a foretaste, a tangible sensory experience of the kindness and blessing that we will receive in the age to come. We have to lean on that, right? As God tells Abram, you use your senses to experience the promised land. We too have to remind ourselves, don't fill our heads with negativity about, oh, so-and-so is such a cynic, oh, so-and-so is so immature. Let's fill ourselves with our memories of blessing that we've received because of our church community. And of course, let's remind ourselves that that tangible joy and peace we receive, first of all, is not just the kindness of the church, but of God sending his Son to die for us. Let us grasp that moment when we first came to Christ, that feeling of all the weight lifted from our shoulders to say, yes, Jesus, I will give anything to you because you sacrificed yourself. Remember that. Take yourself back to that moment when you first came to Christ. How amazing is that? Keep that at the forefront of your minds. Hold on to those memories. Recall the gratitude, the joy you felt during those times. Walk the boundaries of the promised land, so to speak, by remembering, holding on to those promises, those memories. Because these tangible reminders will help us to live out radical kindness to those around us. When we have those pictures in our mind, then it makes sense to be generous to others, right? And so this week, will you keep these reminders at the top of your head? Because anything that we sacrifice as we are generous to others, well, that's nothing in comparison to the kindness and the generosity that we've received and we will experience in the next kingdom. Will you pray with me? Father God, what a wonderful picture it is that we see today. That as amazing as Abram's kindness is, what's more amazing is that you respond to Abram in kind. And we thank you that our promise isn't that we're going to have a promised land, physical promised land, and lots of children, as great as that is, but we have an even better promise, a promise of being with you face to face in the kingdom to come. No sin, no tears. And so, Father, will you help us to reflect on that and enable us to respond in turn with radical kindness and generosity, which leads to an intensification of our experience of the promise, which leads to even more radical kindness and generosity. Father, will you make that the spiral that we spiral deeper and deeper into for the rest of our days? In Jesus' name we pray.